I'm recording this near a going fan, so maybe it'll be a shitty recording, so I apologize if that's the case, but Lord knows it's hot in here. Okay, here we go. Marxian Economics and the Critique of Political Economy by Chris O'Kane and Kirstin Munro. Moishe Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and his negative critique of labor are essential to the development of the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. In Time, Labor, and Social Domination, Pistone demonstrated that mid-20th century Marxian economics consisted in a foreshortened, quote, positive, end quote, critique of capitalism as a mode of unequal distribution premised on an ontological understanding of labor as the source of wealth. In distinction to Marxian economics, Pistone conceived of the critique of political economy as a negative critique of the historically specific capitalist form of labor. Yet the rise of interest in democratic socialism and expanded interpretations of Marx premised on reproductive labor in the state call into question the applicability of Pistone's critique of Marxian economics. These prevalent interpretations of Marx also indicate that Pistone's negative critique of the historically specific form of labor as a critical social theory was incomplete, as it did not critique the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members. This chapter critically expounds on Pistone's critiques of Marxian economics and labor. Part 1 provides an overview of Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and of his interpretation of the critique of political economy as a critique of labor. Part 2 builds on Pistone's critique of Marxian economics to establish that democratic socialism, social reproduction theory, SRT, and the synthetic theories of Jason E. Moore and Nancy Fraser expand on the presuppositions of traditional Marxism and the categories of Marxian economics to offer a positive critique of capitalist society as a mode of distribution from an expanded standpoint of labor. We show that these approaches conceive of socialism as the realization of labor, and as a result, these approaches unwittingly promote the perpetuation of capitalist society. Part 3 disentangles Pistone's negative critique of labor from Pistone's positive emancipatory dynamic, and then extends Pistone's critique of labor to the state and household to develop a negative critique of capitalist society as a historically specific form of labor. The conclusion recaps the argument to demonstrate the vitality of Pistone's critique of labor for the development of critical theory. Pistone's critiques. In Time, Labor, and Social Domination, Pistone develops a distinction, quote, between two fundamentally different modes of critical analysis, a critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor, and on the one hand, and a critique of labor in capitalism on the other, end quote. The critique of labor in capitalism, in turn, also serves as the grounds for Pistone's critique of the analysis of capitalism that proceeds from the standpoint of labor. Pistone's analysis of the critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor is premised on his interpretation of the work of mid-20th century Marxian economics, primarily that of its leading exponents, Maurice Daub, Paul Sweezy, and Ernest Mandel. Pistone argues that according to this approach to Marxian economics, quote, labor is the ontological ground of society, end quote. Quote, the only source of wealth, end quote, and hence the standpoint of a, quote, positive, end quote, critique of, quote, the mode of distribution, end quote. In Marxian economics, capitalism is characterized by the contradictory creation of wealth by social labor, which is appropriated by the capitalist class due to their private ownership of the means of production. Yet according to Marxian economics, this process of production and appropriation is veiled by the market, where it appears that workers are fairly compensated for their labor. Consequently, according to Marxian economics, quote, the essential thrust of Marx's critique of political economy is accordingly to reveal beneath the appearance of the exchange of equivalents the existence of class exploitation. The market and private ownership of the means of production are considered to be the essential capitalist relations of production, which are expressed by the categories of value and surplus value. Social domination is treated as a function of class domination, which in turn is rooted in, quote, private property in land and capital, end quote, Pistone. For Marxian economists, Marx's labor theory of value is tantamount to a, quote, positive, end quote, critique of political economy from the standpoint of labor. In distinction to Marxian economics, critique of capitalism as a mode of distribution from the standpoint of labor, Pistone conceives of the critique of political economy as a, quote, negative critique, end quote, of the historically specific form of labor. According to Pistone, the historically specific form of capitalist labor consists in a unique type of social interdependence of, quote, impersonal, end quote, quasi-objective, end quote, social domination that is, quote, affected by historically unique forms of social relations that are constituted by determinate forms of social practice, end quote. Value and wealth are not synonymous. Labor is not transhistorical, and capitalism is not a mode of exploitation and appropriation premised on private ownership. Rather, capitalist labor is historically specific and possesses twofold dimensions, private and social, abstract and concrete. Marx's categories do not capture the unequal distribution of goods in a system of market exchange premised on private property. Rather, they are categories that critically grasp the historically specific capitalistic organization of production and distribution on the basis of the reciprocal social mediation of abstract and concrete labor. The categories of the commodity, value, surplus value, etc., quote, necessarily express the form of being, Daseinsformen, the determinations of existence, Existenzbestimmungen, end quote, of the historically specific capitalist form of labor as a quasi-objective and abstract type of social domination. Consequently, contra traditional Marxism, quote, the abstract domination and the exploitation of labor characteristic of capitalism are grounded ultimately not in the appropriation of the surplus by the non-laboring classes, but in the form of labor in capitalism, end quote. Following from this interpretation of the critique of political economy as a critique of capitalist labor, Pistone argues that traditional interpretations of Marx, exemplified by mid-20th century Marxian economics, fail to grasp the dual character of labor and its historical specificity. Ultimately, Marxian economics fails to grasp capitalism. This leads to traditional Marxism's foreshortened understanding of how capitalism might be overcome. Socialism is conceived as the, quote, realization of labor, end quote. Capitalism's, quote, unconscious, end quote, mode of distribution, private property in the market, is replaced with the, quote, conscious, end quote, public ownership of the means of production and the public planning of distribution. According to Pistone, such a conception of socialism unwittingly reproduces capitalism. The realization of labor in socialism may do away with private property in the market, yet it perpetuates the capitalist organization of labor in Marx's critical categories, and as a result perpetuates the capitalist form of labor. In Pistone's negative critique, the historically specific form of the dual character of labor, and with it capitalist production and distribution, must be abolished in order to overcome capitalism. In this overview of Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and his critique of the historically specific form of labor, we have shown that there is a stark difference between traditional Marxism's critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor and Pistone's critical theory of the historically specific form of labor. The critique of capitalism from the standpoint of labor offers a, quote, positive critique, end quote, of capitalism as a mode of private distribution from the standpoint of social labor, and conceives of socialism as the realization of social labor via public ownership and distribution. Pistone's critical theory of the historically specific form of labor, on the other hand, provides a negative critique of capitalism as a historically specific form of labor that possesses a dual character inclusive of its private and social, abstract and concrete dimensions that amount to impersonal social domination. So socialism consists of in the abolition of labor. In what follows, we will argue that Pistone's critique of traditional Marxism and his critique of the historically specific form of capitalist labor are essential to the development of critical theory today. We will also show that the current broad applicability of Pistone's notion of traditional Marxism is missed if it is simply applied to contemporary Marxian economics. Moreover, Pistone's critique of labor ultimately does not amount to a negative critical theory of capitalist society. The purpose of our critique of Pistone's critique of labor is to further develop these critical aspects. Section 2. The work of Richard Wolff and Stephen Resnick, Fred Mosley, and David Brennan, and colleagues demonstrates Pistone's critique of Marxian economics is undoubtedly still relevant. Yet this critique of Marxian economics is in itself is incapable of critiquing an array of prevalent criticisms of capitalism. From social democratic notions of political economy to the new Marxist feminist offshoot, social reproduction theory, to synthetic theories of capitalism that expand the standpoint of labor to include the domains of reproductive labor and treat the relationship between the state and the economy as central to their criticisms of capitalism as a mode of distribution. Pistone himself did not predict these developments, let alone provide a broader conception of traditional Marxism that would enable critiquing them. One of the fundamental justifications for Pistone's interpretation of Marx was that traditional Marxism did not respond to the demands of the new social movements. That is, it is true that Pistone points to the wider significance of his critique of traditional Marxism. In particular, Pistone points to the parallels between the standpoint of labor and normative social and political philosophy. In this vein, he discusses how the standpoint of labor parallels the normal critique of the state from the standpoint of civil society, while asserting that his interpretation of the critique of political economy holds that the, quote, changing relationship of state to civil society, as well as the character and development of institutions in each sphere, can be understood only in terms of the intrinsic dynamic of capitalist society, end quote. Pistone indicates, quote, that in this sense, and only in this non-sociologically reductive sense, the difference between the two forms of social critique, end quote, that is, the positive critique of the standpoint of labor and the negative critique of labor, quote, is that between a, quote, bourgeois, end quote, critique of society and a critique of bourgeois society, end quote. Yet Pistone did not develop these points. In this section, we expand on Pistone's critique of Marxian economics to show how social democratic political economy, social reproduction theory, and synthetic theories of capitalism offer positive critiques of capitalism as a mode of distribution from an expansive standpoint of labor, inclusive of reproductive labor that takes place in state institutions and households that unwittingly promote the reproduction of capitalism. Democratic socialist political economy. What we call, quote, democratic socialist political economy, end quote, is prominent in heterodox economics and the new interdisciplinary project of law and political economy. This notion of democratic socialist political economy undergirds the ideas of democratic socialism that are now prevalent in the Anglophone world. Democratic socialist political economy includes the Ricardian interpretations of Marxian economics discussed by Pistone. However, these contemporary interpretations also amalgamate Marx's work alongside classical political economy, John Maynard Keynes, and Karl Polanyi. Elements identified in Pistone's critique of traditional Marxism are essential to democratic socialist political economy's critique of capitalism as a mode of distribution. However, democratic socialist political economy has a broader worldview that is premised on the separation of labor, but also includes the relationship between the economy and the state in its distinction between capitalism and socialism. Social democratic political economy has a trans-historical notion of labor as the source of all wealth. However, it differs from Marxian economics in viewing the fundamental social contradiction that typifies capitalist society as not just between social production and private appropriation premised on private property, but between the public and the private, the state and the economy, encompassing different types of norms, reason, and governance. As a consequence, democratic socialist political economy opposes itself to capitalist political economy by distinguishing between the capitalist and democratic socialist ordering of modern society. In democratic socialist political economy, capitalism is viewed in terms of the public realm of the state serving the private interest of capitalists by enforcing laws and policies that lead to the unequal distribution of wealth created by labor. The social democratic critique of capitalism proceeds from the standpoint of labor to criticize capitalism as a mode of distribution. This positive social democratic critique demonstrates that the state facilitates the private distribution of social labor, demystifying the supposed separation between the state and the economy. Marxian, Polanyian, and Keynesian categories are seen as the hidden creation of the state. These categories capture capitalist processes of unequal distribution. Socialism, in contrast, is conceived of as democratic state policy that serves the general interests of the public, fairly distributing the wealth created by labor. Social reproduction theory. Social reproduction theory is a self-designated interdisciplinary current in contemporary Marxist feminist theory. The notable theorists in social reproduction theory, Susan Ferguson, Titi Bhattacharya, Alan Sears, and Cynthia Aruza, have developed what they have dubbed the, quote, Marxian approach to social reproduction theory, end quote, by drawing on selective interpretations of accounts of the reproduction of labor power by Lisa Vogel, or Lise Vogel, and Italian autonomism, and integrating them into a, quote, classical Marxist, end quote, framework. As Ferguson puts it, quote, the Marxian school of social reproduction feminism observes that Marx did not extend his political economic critique of capitalism to unpaid social reproductive labor, end quote. Yet, as the self-designation, quote, classical Marxist, end quote, suggests, social reproduction theory develops such a, quote, political economic critique, end quote, by extending the presuppositions of the standpoint of labor to reproductive labor. Social reproduction theory draws on and expands the traditional Marxist interpretation of the critique of political economy by including the reproductive labor of, quote, life-making, end quote, in the standpoint of labor, while social reproduction theory contends that productive labor is the trans-historical source of wealth. Reproductive labor is conceived of as the trans-historical type of labor that constitutes and sustains the life that is necessary for labor to create wealth. For social reproduction theory, the, quote, life-making, end quote, of reproductive labor in tandem with productive labor provides the standpoint of social reproduction theory's, quote, positive, end quote, critique of capitalism as a mode of distribution. Social reproduction theory argues that the reproductive labor of life-making makes exploitation and unequal distribution possible. According to social reproduction theory, the relationship between reproductive labor and profit is veiled by capitalist society. Yet according to social reproduction theory, reproductive labor is either unpaid or underpaid, and yet is essential to the production and reproduction of labor power, to the exploitative level of wages, and as a result to exploitation and unequal distribution. Moreover, reproductive, quote, life-making, end quote, creates and reproduces the, quote, desired human qualities and capacities, end quote, that capital exploits by meeting the needs that are necessary to create and sustain life. Following traditional Marxist presuppositions, social reproduction theory offers an expanded critique of capitalism as an exploitative and dominating process of distribution which is extrinsic to the form of capitalist production and reproduction itself. Social reproduction theory also expands the traditional Marxist conception of communism. Reproductive laborers are members of the proletariat because they sustain the proletariat. Reproductive workers are also dominated and indirectly exploited by the capitalist class. For social reproduction theory, the contradiction between the development of the forces and relations of productions immiserate reproductive labor. So according to this perspective, the seizing of totality and communism entails seizing and unleashing the productive forces and reproductive forces of life-making under common ownership and public planning. Fraser and Moore's synthetic theories. Nancy Fraser and Jason E. Moore's synthetic theories of capitalism draw together the social democratic and social reproductive criticisms of capitalism to criticize capitalism as a mode of distribution from an expanded standpoint of labor while advocating for an expanded idea of socialism. Fraser conceives of capitalism as a, quote, institutionalized social order, end quote, that is premised on the exploitation of labor and the unpaid expropriation of the, quote, background spheres, end quote, of reproductive labor in nature. Fraser further contends that such an institutionalized social order is facilitated by the state and is realized in profit. Yet it is, quote, disavowed, end quote. Fraser's, quote, positive, end quote, critique of the capitalistic institutionalized order of modern society unveils this process of exploitation and appropriation from the standpoint of productive and reproductive labor. Fraser's, quote, expanded idea of socialism, end quote, consists in the democratic state management of the distribution of the surplus created by productive and reproductive labor, premised on the norms of each of these spheres of modern society. Moore, in his own work and in his work with Raj Patel, argues that capitalist profit is made possible through the, quote, cheapening, end quote, of productive and reproductive labor, money, lives, and nature. Socialism consists in, quote, reparation ecology, end quote, a process premised on, quote, recognition, reparation, redistribution, reimagination, and recreation, end quote, in which people, activities, and the environment are valued at their worth and society is democratically ruled on this basis. Consequences of this expanded standpoint of labor. Consequences of this expanded standpoint of labor. As this overview of democratic socialist political economy, social reproduction theory, and Fraser and Moore's synthetic theories of capitalism demonstrates, Pastone's critique of Marxian economics is both fundamental and inadequate to these theories. These three contemporary approaches certainly conceive of capitalism as an unconscious mode of distribution that is criticized from the standpoint of labor. Yet the conception of labor is expanded. The object of criticism for these approaches is capitalist distribution, However, while the criticism is ostensibly directed at the market, it is ultimately directed at the state's central role implementing capitalist distribution. Rather than simply seeing Marx's categories as economic categories of exploitative distribution, these categories are said to be made possible by the state and reproductive labor and even nature. For these approaches, Marx's categories are concealed not only by the market, but also veiled by society. Following Pastone, socialism is certainly conceived in these theories as the, quote, conscious, end quote, social regulation of distribution by public planning, yet socialism is grounded on this expanded conception of labor and expressed through the democratic state management of distribution. Pastone's critique of Marxian economics focuses on the mid-20th century work of Dobbs, Sweezy, and Mandel, but his critique of the standpoint of labor is all too relevant today. At the same time, Pastone's critique of Marxian economics is too limited. For democratic socialist political economy, social reproduction theory, and Fraser and Moore's synthetic theories of capitalism expand on these presuppositions to develop positive theories of the mode of distribution of entirety of bourgeois society. These notions of socialism unwittingly promote the perpetuation of capitalism, transforming labor into a broad ontological principle that envisions socialism as the, quote, realization, end quote, of productive and reproductive labor by overcoming, quote, its mode of distribution, end quote, private property and the market, and replacing it with public ownership of the means of production and the public planning of distribution at the behest of a democratic state that distributes the proceeds of labor on the basis of extant norms. While these contemporary approaches leave much to be desired, they still point to the shortcomings of Pastone's negative critique with respect to a negative critical theory of society. In the next section, we show the vitality of Pastone's negative critique of capitalism as a historically specific form of labor by extending Pastone's critique to the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members. Section 3. The tension between Pastone's negative critique of the historically specific form of capitalist labor and Pastone's emancipatory dynamic need to be addressed. In Pastone's negative critique of labor, capitalism consists in a historically specific form of labor that needs to be abolished to achieve human emancipation. Yet this negative critique sits uneasily with Pastone's larger effort to revitalize critical theory. Pastone's attempt to revitalize critical theory mirror Habermas's justification for formulating his own approach to critical theory. They share the contention that Adorno and Horkheimer's critical theory is one-dimensional and lacks an emancipatory basis. While the emancipatory grounds Habermas and Pastone developed were certainly distinct from one another, their ensuing social theories nonetheless possess striking similarities. Pastone's approach to rejuvenating critical theory consists in grasping the emancipatory potential of a pre-existing social dynamic whose further development he believes points to the emancipatory overcoming of capitalism, an approach he shares with Habermas and even the traditional Marxism that Pastone criticizes. For traditional Marxism, the forces of production will, in the course of their development, come into contradiction with the relations of production. The contradiction will lead to the revolutionary seizure of the forces of production by the proletariat and the realization of labor as the unfettering of productive forces. Habermas argued that the evolution of contemporary society led to complexity and the systematic differentiation of the spheres of the economy, state, and the world and life world. The unmooring of the neutral spheres of the state and the economy had come into contradiction with the private sphere. For Habermas, the public sphere should use the state as a, quote, conveyor belt, end quote, unleashing the democratic rule of the public sphere over the state and the economy. For Pastone, the development of the forces of production would lead to the displacement of labor and the diminishment of value. The development of the forces of production, the displacement of labor, and the diminishment of value would serve as the emancipatory grounds for, quote, a growing contradiction between the sort of labor people perform under capitalism and the sort of labor they could perform if value were abolished, and the productive potential developed under capitalism were reflexively used to liberate people from the sway of the alienated structures constituted by their own labor, end quote. Since Pastone's interpretation of this dynamic of development, displacement, and diminishment does not consider relative surplus value or countervailing state measures, his interpretation of the dynamic of accumulation is called into question. The emancipatory basis of Pastone's attempt to rejuvenate critical theory is akin to a sociological model of progressive technological, future-oriented social development that mirrors both the classical Marxist notion of an emancipatory crisis and Habermas's notion of social development. It is also fetishistic and distinct from a negative critique of the historically specific form of labor. Pastone's emancipatory dynamic of development, displacement, and diminishment relies on the continuing domination of the reified subject of capital and the exploitation of labor to realize emancipation. But negative critique implies an emancipatory notion of the contemporary necessity of the collective negation of the organization of the historically specific social form of capitalism in response to social domination. In what follows, we separate Pastone's negative critique of capitalist society as a historically specific critique of labor from Pastone's emancipatory dynamic. We also extend Pastone's negative critique of capitalist society as a historically specific form of labor to a critique of the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members. Pistone's negative critique of labor does not critique these dimensions of capitalist society. However, the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members are implicit in Pistone's general statements that, quote, in constituting a self-grounding social mediation, labor constitutes a determinate sort of social whole, a totality, end quote. And that, quote, the historically specific character of this labor is intrinsically related to the form of social interdependence characteristic of capitalist society. It constitutes a historically specific quasi-objective form of social mediation within the framework of Marx's analysis, serves as the ultimate social ground of modernity's basic features, end quote. As Pistone demonstrates in his analysis of Marx's categories, quote, value refers to the capitalist organization of production, while Marx's categories describe objective, subjective modes of being. Hence, quote, within the framework of Marx's analysis, value is a form of wealth that is not extrinsic to production or to the other social, quote, institutions, end quote, in capitalism, but rather is intrinsic to them and shapes them. As a form of mediation, value generates a process of ongoing transformation and reconstitution, end quote. Pistone states that civil society and the state are not separate but are, quote, embedded, end quote, and, quote, transformed, end quote, by this value-mediated, quote, process of transformation and reconstitution, end quote. Although Pistone does not specifically apply this insight to reproductive labor, the non-separability of reproductive labor, civil society, and the state can be inferred given that much of reproductive labor is carried out by employees of the state, while other aspects of reproductive labor are carried out in households. Proletarian households do not represent a separate, quote, domestic sphere, end quote, but rather are linked to the state and economy via the value dynamic of, quote, transformation and reconstitution, end quote. In order to sketch how the historically specific form of labor constitutes a, quote, determinate, end quote, quote, social whole, end quote, inclusive of the state, household, and reproductive labor, it is necessary to begin by supplementing Pistone's account of the historically specific form of labor with an account of its genesis. While Pistone points to, quote, determinate social relations that constitute, end quote, the historically specific form of labor, he does not elaborate on their genesis, nor the genesis of the other institutions in this, quote, social whole, end quote. Following Bonefeld, the historically specific social form of capitalist production, Following Bonefeld, the historically specific social form of capitalist society was created by the violent process of primitive accumulation. The state separated people from their means of reproduction and expropriated land and wealth for the ruling class. This created the capital relation and the historically specific forms of labor and wealth. The state was transformed into the capitalist state and the private household emerged. Now that we have outlined the, quote, social ground, end quote, of this whole, we turn to indicate how it, quote, shaped, end quote, by a, quote, historically specific quasi-objective form of social mediation. Now that we have outlined the, quote, social ground, end quote, of this whole, we turn to indicate how it is, quote, shaped, end quote, by a, quote, historically specific quasi-objective form of social mediation, end quote. We follow Pistone in holding that capitalist production does not consist in the transhistorical production of wealth that is unequally distributed due to the institutions of private property in the market. Furthermore, Marx's categories do not capture this market-veiled unequal allocation of social wealth. Instead, labor is characterized by its historically specific dual character. Value is the historically specific form of wealth. Capital shapes production and produces goods with the sole intent of valorizing value. Marx's categories capture the necessary appearance of this historically specific form of labor in the form of value, money, and its ensuing dynamic of accumulation and reproduction. As, quote, determinate modes of being, end quote, that mediate and compel concrete activity, quote, generating a process of ongoing transformation and reconstitution, end quote, in the separate yet interrelated spheres of the economy, state, and household. Since capitalists are, quote, personifications of economic categories, end quote, capitalists are compelled to compete with other capitalists by this, quote, quasi-objective, end quote, form of social mediation, the historically specific natural laws of accumulation to acquire profit in the form of money. Since workers are free from the means to sustain themselves and free to sell their labor power, they are compelled to compete with other proletarians to sell their labor power for money in order to sustain themselves. Since profit is incumbent upon selling commodities while maximizing surplus value, capitalists compete to increase working hours, lower wages, and increase productivity. This competition between capitalists to increase productivity leads to the revolutionizing of production via supervision, a strict division of labor, and an increasing reliance on machinery. The dynamic is replicated across the social division of labor as a whole. The result is a blind, crisis-ridden process that produces recurring crises, the accumulation of wealth at one pole and misery at the other pole, and the, quote, multiplication, end quote, of the proletariat and the reproduction of separation on a, quote, extended scale, end quote. The capitalist state is the, quote, organized force of society, end quote. Since this society is capitalist society and not merely the capitalist organization of the distribution of the proceeds of modern society, it is a force for, quote, social enslavement, end quote, and the object of the critique of political economy. Following Simon Clark and Werner Bonefeld, the capitalist state protects property and perpetuates the propertyless, reinforcing and perpetuating the historically specific form of labor. Constitutions codify the historically specific form of labor and displace class antagonism to the representative politics of the political sphere. In the political sphere, elected officials ostensibly vie to represent the general will of the public on the basis of different social and economic policies. While these policies can undoubtedly be progressive or regressive, they are nevertheless realized in bureaucracies by reproductive workers employed by the state who administer the population, reproducing individuals as bearers of the commodity labor power, thus perpetuating the capitalist social form. As Munro shows, state employees in state bureaucracies, ranging from education to welfare to health care, are not virtuous life makers. They do not instill children with the skills and norms that are needed to produce goods that would meet human needs, barring the capitalist mode of distribution, nor do they sustain adults who already possess these skills and norms. Rather, education consists in what Adorno calls, quote, house training, end quote, eradicating autonomy and critical thinking and instilling the discipline, authority, and competitiveness necessary for bearers of the commodity labor power to beat out their competitors and excel at jobs that entail a range of activities performed by the capitalist division of labor. Welfare subjects the unemployed to a punitive bureaucracy that pays them a bare minimum to tide them over until they find new work. This reinforces the wage and ultimately capital accumulation. Healthcare subjects people to an administration tasked with sustaining people's ability to sell the commodity of labor power in order to valorize value. Finally, the police promote the reproduction of the commodity labor power via enforcing laws that protect property and administer social individuals to act as virtuous sellers of labor power by incarcerating troublesome lawbreakers. Consequently, these state bureaucracies and their functionaries enact, quote, reproductive life-making, end quote, by administering the population, depoliticizing class struggle, raising and preserving individuals as bearers of the commodity of labor power. These state institutions and these activities impose market dependency, maim individuals, and contribute to the reproduction of the historically specific form of labor. Expanding on Clark, the general interest of society and the general will of the public is the general interest of capital. Like the state and the reproductive laborers employed by state bureaucracies, reproductive domestic labor in households is not a virtuous activity of, quote, life-making, end quote, quote, thwarted by, end quote, by the capitalist mode of distribution. Rather, quote, private life, the zone of individuality, is absorbed by so-called social activities and thus likewise molded by the schemata of society, end quote. As Munro shows, the household and household production are mediated by and mediate the crisis-ridden dynamic of capital accumulation and reproduction. The very existence of the household is incumbent on primitive accumulation, private property, law enforcement, wages, and state provision of goods and services. Sustaining a household necessitates selling labor power for a wage and performing domestic labor that, along with commodities purchased with wages and state inputs, sustain household members' ability to perform productive and reproductive labor. Households combine commodities purchased with wages, state goods and services, and domestic labor in shifting proportions to produce day-to-day life, contributing to the crisis-ridden process of accumulation both directly and indirectly. Households create a new generation of workers to be exploited, sustain those who are unemployed or between jobs, and sustain those unable to work, keeping down wages. By responding to the crisis-ridden process of accumulation via these activities of reproduction, households are part of it, contributing to the reproduction of labor power and thus capitalist society as a historically specific form of labor. Productive and reproductive labor in the state and the household are integral to reproducing the negative totality of capitalist society as a historically specific form of labor. In contrast to democratic socialist political economy, social reproduction theory, and synthetic theories of capitalism, such a society is not characterized by the capturing of the proceeds of productive and reproductive labor by capital on the basis of state policies that serve these private interests. Rather, productive labor and reproductive labor of the state and the household are integral to the historically specific form of labor as a form of social mediation of the social whole that shapes and reproduces its institutions. Productive labor is realized in a crisis-ridden dynamic of abstract and concrete labor that maims and displaces a labor force that overproduces junk for the sake of profit. The reproductive bureaucracies of the state, as well as the household, dominate and sustain social individuals as bearers of the commodity labor power, reproducing the historically specific form of labor. In critiquing this negative form of social unity, we have expanded on Pistone's critique of labor to provide a negative critique of capitalist society, indicating how a historically specific form of labor is constitutive of a, quote, quasi-objective, end quote, form of social mediation that shapes the social whole. We have also pointed out how the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members reproduce the historically specific form of labor. Taken together, these moments perpetuate the social whole. In this perspective, socialism does not consist in the realization of productive and reproductive labor and their fair distribution of its proceeds via a social democratic state, but rather their abolition. Conclusion. Moïse Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and his negative critique of labor are essential to the development of the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. However, Pistone's critique of Marxian economics is not sufficient to critique the now prevalent approaches of democratic socialist political economy, social reproduction theory, and the synthetic categories of capitalism that draw these approaches together. Moreover, Pistone's negative critique of labor is supplanted by an emancipatory account of progressive technological development that mirrors traditional Marxism and Habermasian critical theory. Finally, Pistone's critique of the historically specific form of labor does not critique the state, household, or reproductive labor. This chapter has sought to demonstrate the vitality of Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and his negative critique of the historically specific form of labor by expanding on them in this regard. We first mentioned that democratic socialist political economy, SRT, and Fraser and Moore's synthetic theories of capitalism extend Marxian economics critique of capitalism as a mode of distribution by conceiving of productive and reproductive labor as the transhistorical source of life and wealth that is unequally distributed because the state acts in the private interests of capitalists. These approaches expand upon Marxian economics' interpretation of Marx's economic categories as categories of distribution that are veiled by the market, arguing that unpaid reproductive labor and even nature are ultimately represented in profit. Sorry. For these approaches, this process is veiled by what Fraser calls the disavowal of institutionalized order of capitalist society. The expanded idea of socialism envisioned in these approaches is conceived as the, quote, realization, end quote, of this extended notion of labor via the democratic social state's public management of distribution. We then turn to illustrate the importance of Pistone's negative critique of capitalism as a historically specific form of labor for the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. Expanding on Pistone's definition of labor as a structuring form of social mediation, we showed that the critique of labor can be extended to encompass the negative dynamic unity of the economy, state and household, and thus how capitalist society is constituted and reproduced by the historically specific unity of productive and reproductive labor. This chapter indicates the centrality of Pistone's critique of Marxian economics and his critique of labor to the further development of the critique of political economy as a critical social theory. In the first place, we have demonstrated how democratic socialist political economy, social reproduction theory, and Fraser and Moore's synthetic theories of capital extend Marxian economics, offering a critique of capitalism as a mode of distribution from an expanded standpoint of labor that unwittingly promotes the perpetuation of capitalism rather than its abolition. In the second place, we have demonstrated that the negative critique of labor also entails the negation of the historically specific institutions and types of reproductive labor that reinforce and reproduce it. Pistone's insights can be used to further develop the critique of political economy as a critical social theory by showing that it is necessary to negate not only productive labor but also the state, the household, and the reproductive labor of state employees and household members.